Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Have you ever been, absolutely certain you were right about something, but literally no one believed you? Well, take that feeling and multiply it by 1,000,000. Today, we're uncovering the hidden history of the most brilliant minds who were ruthlessly punished for being right. As you're watching this explainer here on YouTube, we're going to be drawing on some truly mind-blowing stories from the incredible new book, Right Too Soon. It tracks this deeply ingrained pattern in human history where world-changing ideas are initially just totally rejected.
Seriously, I want you to imagine the sheer isolation of knowing a life-saving truth only to have the entire world laugh right in your face. We like to think that science is this perfectly rational machine, right? That when undeniable evidence is presented, everyone just applauds and updates their textbooks. But as we're about to see, science is practiced by people. And people have egos, blind spots, and a deep, deep fear of having their worldview shattered. So what actually happens when you arrive with a truth the world just isn't ready for?
Part 1. The Semmelweis Reflex.
Let's kick things off with a literal medical nightmare from 1847, where this exact dynamic was a matter of life and death. The setting is the Vienna General Hospital, which was one of the most prestigious medical institutions of its day. Back then, the orthodox view in medicine was that diseases were caused by miasma, basically bad air or atmospheric vapors. But a young Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed something terrifying. He realized doctors were going straight from performing autopsies in the dissection room right to delivering babies in the maternity ward. Semmelweis proposed a highly heretical view. He argued that doctors were actually carrying invisible cadaverous particles on their own hands and infecting the laboring mothers.
The data he looked at to prove this was just horrific, but it forced Semmelweis to take action. There was a stark contrast. In the ward run by physicians and medical students, the maternal death rate from childbed fever was staggering, anywhere between 13 and 18%. But in the ward run by midwives who did not perform autopsies, the death rate was only 2%. Faced with this, Semmelweis ordered mandatory hand washing using a chlorinated lime solution, and wouldn't you know it, the death rate plummeted instantly. You'd think he'd be hailed as a hero, right? Nope. Instead, he was essentially chased out of town. The medical establishment was deeply offended by the implication that gentlemen doctors had dirty hands that were killing their patients.
Moving on to Part 2, the 4 forces of resistance. The pushback was so severe that Semmelweis actually suffered a breakdown and was driven into an asylum, where he tragically died. This horrific historical injustice brings us right to the core framework of the book, Right Too Soon. Why does this keep happening? Well, the book outlines 4 specific forces of resistance that create a recurring pattern of rejection. So the crucial point is that a correct idea is often crushed by these 4 distinct forces. First, you have authority. That's the heavy thumb of eminent experts on the scale. Second is institutional gatekeeping, the systems that are meant to filter out nonsense but sometimes end up filtering out genius instead. Third is the absence of a framework, when an idea shows up before the conceptual scaffolding even exists to understand it. And finally, a threat to the status quo, when new facts jeopardize established reputations or massive industries. And listen, this isn't just an 1800s problem. This pattern repeats across every century and every scientific discipline.
Section 3. Crushed by authority. Let's see how this builds by looking at the terrifying power of established authority. Because science is supposed to answer to evidence, but honestly, it often defaults to answering to eminence. In the 1930s, a brilliant 24-year-old physicist named Subramanian Chandrasekhar was on a boat from India to England. During the voyage, he crunched the math on quantum mechanics and relativity and realized something astonishing. Above a certain mass, a dying star simply cannot support its own weight. It just keeps collapsing. He had mathematically pointed the way to what we now know as black holes and neutron stars. When he presented his findings at the Royal Astronomical Society, the era's most famous and powerful astronomer, Sir Arthur Eddington, stood up right after him and publicly humiliated the young man. He called the whole concept a reductio ad absurdum. He went so far as to say there should be a law of nature to prevent a star from behaving in this absurd way. The entire room deferred to Eddington's immense reputation to squash and mathematical truth. Chandrasekhar was so wounded he left Britain for America, and it took decades for the field to catch up to his math.
And this isn't just some anomaly from the 30s. Decades later, in 1982, a researcher named Dan Shechtman discovered quasicrystals. These were solids with a molecular structure that everyone thought was physically impossible. He faced the exact same force of authority when 2-time Nobel laureate Linus Pauling used his massive influence to stall the acceptance of quasicrystals, dropping this absolutely savage quote, "There are no quasicrystals, only quasi-scientists." Ouch, right? Shechtman was mocked and practically ostracized for years before he was finally vindicated with his own Nobel Prize.
All right, Part 4, the gatekeepers of science. Beyond individual authorities, there are institutional gatekeepers meant to filter out nonsense, but they frequently filter out genius instead, simply because the new idea doesn't look like the old ideas. Take the case of John James Waterston. In 1845, working in isolation in Bombay, Waterston essentially solved how gases behave at a molecular level, the kinetic theory of gases. He figured out that pressure and temperature come from the motion of countless molecules, essentially laying out the math decades before anyone else. He proudly sent his paper back to the prestigious Royal Society in London.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer arrogance of gatekeeping. The referee for the Royal Society dismissed his groundbreaking physics with a brutal review, calling it, quote, nothing but nonsense, unfit even for reading. But it gets worse. By the Society's rules at the time, they not only rejected his paper, but they literally locked it in a drawer in their archives so he couldn't even get his manuscript back to publish it somewhere else.
Think about the sheer amount of time lost here. He submitted the work in 1845. After decades of being unrecognized and increasingly bitter, Waterston disappeared in 1883, presumed drowned. He vanished entirely before someone randomly found his buried masterpiece in the archives in 1891, 45 years after it was submitted. The gatekeepers literally locked away the future of physics in a desk drawer.
55 years. Just let that sink in. That is how long Peyton Rouse had to wait after proving in 1911 that a virus could cause cancer before finally receiving his Nobel Prize at age 87. The medical establishment just absolutely refused to believe that cancer could be transmissible in any form, so they just ignored him for half a century.
Which brings us to Section 5, Threats to the Status Quo.
What happens when the truth doesn't just bruise a scientist's ego, but directly threatens an entire multi-billion-dollar industry and a deeply entrenched medical consensus? The resistance gets even fiercer. In the early 1980s, the absolute unquestioned consensus was that stomach ulcers were caused by stress, spicy foods, and too much acid. An entire lucrative industry was built around anti-acid drugs and ulcer surgeries. But two Australian researchers, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, realized ulcers weren't a psychological problem or an acid problem. They were a simple bacterial infection caused by a microbe called H. pylori.
They presented their findings and were met with a wall of medical scoffing. People literally walked out of their talks. Everyone knew bacteria couldn't survive in stomach acid. So, faced with this brick wall of stubbornness, Marshall did the unthinkable. He essentially poisoned himself. He brewed a broth of the H. pylori bacteria and drank it straight down. He literally gave himself severe gastritis, just to force the medical world to look at the evidence. He cured himself with antibiotics, and eventually the pair won the Nobel Prize, fundamentally changing how we treat stomach diseases today.
Finally, Section 6, the arc of vindication. The most comforting takeaway from all these stories is that the universe does not care about our academic ranks, our bruised egos, or our commercial interests. The evidence always wins eventually. Consider Gregor Mendel, a monk who painstakingly documented the laws of genetics by counting roughly 28,000 pea plants in his monastery garden. He published the foundational laws of inheritance in 1866, and crickets. Complete silence. It sat completely ignored because the framework just wasn't there for people to understand it. Mendel died in 1884 believing his life's work was a total failure. It wasn't until 1900, when 3 different scientists independently rediscovered his laws, that the world realized Mendel had beaten them to it by over 30 years. So, what's the big takeaway from this explainer? It reveals this profound human drama. First, the truth has no deadline. It'll wait for us to be ready. Second, and this is super important, just because you are attacked doesn't mean you are right. There are plenty of cranks out there, for sure. Evidence is what makes you right. But third, our tragic refusal to accept hard facts costs us years of progress and countless lives. Just think of all the mothers who died before doctors finally agreed to wash their hands. So why does this matter to you and me today? It matters because if we want to advance as a society, and if we genuinely want to be critical thinkers, we have to start paying much closer attention to the heretics who actually bring the data. It's a standing argument for humility, really, for holding our own deeply ingrained certainties just a little bit more loosely, and maybe listening to the person everyone else has decided to ignore.
We've really only scratched the surface today. If you want to dive deeper and discover all 39 of these incredible stories, you need to read the book Right Too Soon, which is what we've been unpacking in this explainer. Check the description below to grab your copy today. I'll leave you with this provocative thought. What absolute certainty of yours might be completely wrong, and are you ready to change how you see the world today?